Database application development, session 5 of module 3, database management system, 18 CS 53, content for learning management system under Department of Collegiate and Technical Education. In this session, we will discuss about an introduction to JDBC, JDBC architecture, JDBC classes and interfaces, JDBC driver management, connections in JDBC, executing SQL statements, result sets, exceptions and warnings, examining database metadata, and then multiple choice questions, answers, references. An introduction to JDBC, Java Database Connectivity, ODBC and JDBC. ODBC short for Open Database Connectivity and JDBC short for Java Database Connectivity. Enable the integration of SQL, ODBC and JDBC enable the integration of SQL with a general purpose programming language. Both ODBC and JDBC expose database capabilities in a standardized way to the application programming through application programming interfaces. ODBC and JDBC database APIs are alternative to embedding. Rather than modify, compiler add library with database calls, means APIs. An application that interacts with a data source through ODBC or JDBC select a data source dynamically, loads the corresponding driver, establishes a connection with the data source. And then pass SQL strings from language, presents result sets in a language friendly way. JDBC is developed by Sense Microsystem. It provides Java application programming interfaces. A driver tracks the calls and translates them into DBMS specific code, and it also connects database can be across a network. Next, JDBC architecture, Java Database Connectivity Architecture. There are 4 components of Java Database Connectivity Architecture. The first component is application. It initiates and terminates connections, submits structured query language statements, SQL statements. Driver manager, it loads Java database connectivity driver, and then driver, it connects to data source, transmits request and returns or translate results and error codes. And the fourth component of the JDBC architecture is data source, which processes SQL statements. The application initiates and terminates the connections with a data source. It sets transaction boundaries and then submits SQL statements and also retrieves the results. The primary goal of the driver manager is to load JDBC drivers and pass JDBC function calls from the application to the correct driver, and then the driver establishes the connection with the data source. The data source processes comments from the driver and returns results. There are four types of drivers. Type 1 driver, type 2 driver, type 3 drivers and type 4 drivers. Type 1 driver is also called as bridge. This type of driver translates SQL comments into non-native API, application programming interface. For example, JDBC ODBC bridge. An application can use JDBC calls to access an ODBC compliant data source. The application loads only one driver. The bridge, only one driver, the bridge. Bridges have the advantage that it is easy to piggyback the application onto an existing installation, and no new drivers have to be installed. But using bridges has several drawbacks. The increased number of layers between data source and application affects performance. In addition, the user is limited to the functionality that the ODBC driver supports. And the second type of JDBC driver is type 2 driver. It's also called as direct translation to native API via non-Java driver. This type of driver translates SQL comments to native API of data source. It needs OS specific binary on each client. This type of driver translates JDBC function calls directly into method invocations of the API of one specific data source. The driver is usually written using a combination of C++ and Java. It is dynamically linked and specific to the data source. This architecture performs significantly better than a JDBC ODBC bridge. One disadvantage is that the database driver that implements the API needs to be installed on each computer that runs the application. The third type of driver is type 3. It is also called as network bridges. The driver talks over a network to a middleware server. Means it sends comments over the network to a middleware server that talks to the data source, and it needs only small JDBC driver at each client. In this case, the driver on the client side is not DBMS specific. The JDBC driver loaded by the application can be quite small, as the only functionality it needs to implement is sending of SQL statements to the middleware server. The middleware server can then use a type 2 JDBC driver to connect to the data source. And another type of driver is type 4, and is also called as direction translation to native API via Java driver. It converts JDBC calls directly to network protocol used by DBMS. Needs DBMS specific Java driver at each client. Third type of drivers does not need DBMS specific Java drivers at each client, but the fourth type of driver needs DBMS specific Java driver at each client. Here, instead of calling the DBMS API directly, the driver communicates with the DBMS through Java sockets. In this case, the driver on the client side is written in Java, but it is DBMS specific. It translates JDBC calls into the native API of the database system. This solution does not require an intermediate layer, and since the implementation is all Java, its performance is usually quite good. Then JDBC classes and interfaces. JDBC is a collection of Java classes and interfaces that enables database access from programs written in the Java language. It contains a methods for connecting to a remote data source, executing SQL statements, examining sets of results from SQL statements, transaction management, and exception handling. The classes and interfaces are part of the java.sql package. Thus, all code fragmented in the remainder of this section should be included the statement import java.sql.star at the beginning of the code. There are 3 steps to submit a database query. Load. The first step is to load the JDBC driver, and then the second step, connect to the data source, and the third step is to execute SQL statements. Next, JDBC driver management. In JDBC, data source drivers are managed by the driver managers. Data source drivers are managed by the driver manager class, which maintains a list of all currently loaded drivers. The driver manager class has methods register driver, deregister driver, and get drivers to enable dynamic addition and deletion of drivers. Loading a JDBC driver. In the Java code, we use the statement class dot for name within quotations Oracle plus JDBC driver dot Oracle driver. This is the Java example to load a JDBC driver. Next, connections in Java database connectivity. A session with a data source is started through a connection object. A connection identifier. A connection identifies a logical session with a data source. Multiple connections within the same Java program can refer to different data sources or same data sources. Connections are specified through a JDBC URL. A URL that uses the JDBC protocol. URL means uniform resource locator. URL as a form JDBC colon within this symbols you have to write the sub protocol colon other parameters. For example, string URL is equal to this one. This is the uniform resource locator. Connection, CON is a variable of type connection. Try begin, CON is equal to driver manager dot get connection of URL comma user ID comma password and catch SQL exception. Okay, then say exception. If there is any exceptions, it will catch the exceptions. Then connection class interface. In connection class interface, public int get translation isolation and void set transaction isolation of int level, sets isolation level for the current connections. Okay, these two class interfaces sets isolation level for the current connection. Next, public boolean get read only and void set read only of boolean b. These two interfaces specifies whether transactions in this connection are read only. Next, public boolean get auto commit and void set auto commit of boolean b. If auto commit is set, then each SQL statement is considered its own transaction. Otherwise, a transaction is committed using commit or aborted using rollback. Public boolean is closed. This interface checks whether the connection is still open or not. Then executing SQL statements. There are three different ways of executing SQL statements. The first way is statements. Statements means both static and dynamic SQL statements. And the second way is to prepared statements, which means semi-static SQL statements. And third way is callable statements, which means stored procedures. Statement means it has both static and dynamic SQL statements. The prepared statement class. The prepared statement class is dynamically generates pre-compiled SQL statements that can be used several times. The prepared statements class is dynamically generates pre-compiled SQL statements that can be used several times. These SQL statements can have parameters. These SQL statements can have parameters, but their structure is fixed. When the prepared statement object representing the SQL statement is created. Here, the values of parameters are determined at runtime. For example, string SQL equal to insert into sailors values. These are the values. Prepared statement PSTMT is equal to CON connection. That prepare statement of SQL PSTMT dot clear parameters PSTMT dot set int of 1 comma SID PSTMT dot set strings of 2 comma sname PSTMT dot set int of 3 comma rating PSTMT dot set float of 4 comma age. Here need to insert 4 values 1, 2, 3, 4. Then connecting. Okay, PSTMT means is a type of prepared statement. CON is a connection connecting to the data source. That prepared statement of SQL for clear parameters. There is no parameters within the parentheses. P statement dot set int of 1 comma SID PSTMT dot set string 2 comma sname PSTMT dot set int of 3 comma rating PSTMT dot set float of 4 comma age. We know that no rows are returned, thus we use execute update method. This execute update method returns an integer indicating the number of rows in the SQL statement modified. It returns 0 for successful execution without modifying any rows. The execute query method is used if the SQL statement returns data such as in a regular select query, JDBC has its own cursor mechanism in the form of result set object. The execute method is more general than execute query and execute update. Next, result sets. The statement execute query returns a result set object which is similar to a cursor. Result set cursors in JDBC are very powerful. They allow forward and reverse scrolling and in place editing and insertions. The prepared statement dot execute update only returns the number of affected records. Prepared statement dot execute query returns data encapsulated in a result set object, means a cursor. Result set rs is equal to pstmt dot execute query of SQL. Here rs is a cursor while rs dot next begin process the data. A result sets is a very powerful cursor and it provides previous function, means it moves one row back, and it also provides observed of int num moves to the row with the specified number, relative of int num moves forward or backward, first and last. First and last means first means it moves to the first row, last means it moves to the last row. Then matching Java and SQL data types. In SQL, get it matches boolean of Java class. Result set get method get boolean. Char string get string. Varchar string get string. Double get double. Float double get double. Integer get int. Real double get float. Date java.sql.date get date. Time java.sql.time get time. Timestamp java.sql.timestamp get timestamp. These are all the matching of SQL data type to Java. JDBC provides special data types and specifies their relationship to corresponding SQL data types. With these methods, we can retrieve values from the current row of the query result referenced by the result set object. Next, JDBC exceptions and warning. Similar to the SQL state variable, most of the methods in Java.SQL can throw an exception of type SQL exception if an error occurs. The information includes SQL state, a string that describes an error, whether the statements contained an SQL syntax error In addition to the standard get message method inherited from the throwable, SQL exceptions has two additional methods that provide further information and a method to get additional exceptions. Public string get SQL state method returns an SQL state identifier based on the SQL 1999 specifications. Public int get error code function retrieves a vendor specific error code. Public SQL exception get next exception method gets the next exception in a chain of exception associated with the current SQL exception object. SQL warning is a subclass of SQL exceptions. Warnings are not severe as errors, and the program can usually proceed without special handling of warnings. Warnings are not thrown like other exceptions, and they are not part of the try catch block around a java.sql statement. For example, try begin stmt is equal to con dot create statement, warning is equal to con dot get warnings, while warning not is equal to null, and SQL warnings, warning is equal to warning dot get next warning. Con dot clear warnings, stmt dot execute update of query string, warning is equal to con dot get warnings, and end the try block. Catch SQL exceptions, SQL E, then handle the exception E. Then examining database metadata, we can use the database metadata object to obtain information about the database system and the catalog. For example, the following code fragment shows how to obtain name and driver version of the JDBC driver. Database metadata md is equal to con dot get metadata. This one, print information about the driver, system dot out dot println of name plus md dot get driver name, version plus md dot get driver version. Database metadata md is equal to con dot get metadata. Results sets trs is equal to md dot get tables of null 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 string table name. While trs.next begin table name is equal to trs.get string of table underscore name, system dot out dot println of table name, and then print all the attributes. Result set CRS is equal to md dot get columns null comma table name comma null, while CRS dot next begin system dot out dot println of CRS dot get string of column name. Here this is the example of the complete example of the examining database metadata. Then multiple choice questions. Match the following query answer and their meaning. Query and their meaning. Previous 0, absolute int num, relative int num, first 0. Previous 0 means moves back one row. Previous 0 means moves back one row. Previous method moves back one row. Absolute of int num means moves to the row which is the specified number. Absolute of int num means moves to the row with the specified number. Relative of int num means moves forward or backward relative to the current position. First method moves to the first row. For A 4, for B 1, for C 2, for D 3. Thank you.